I want to start off by introducing ourselves. I'm Jessica Rigby. I'm an associate professor in education, policy, organizations, and leadership in the College of Education at UW. And Stephanie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Foreman, and I'm a postdoc working with at the College of Education at UW as well.
And we worked as part of a team that includes Elham Kazemi, Lamar Foster, and Sarah Clancy on the initial policy brief that, that this is an update from. So first, I want to start by saying that we all exist on Indigenous land, and we acknowledge the ancestral homelands of those who walked here before us and those who still walk here, keeping in mind the integrity of this territory where area Native peoples identify as the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, and Puyallup, as well as the tribes of the Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and other Coast Salish peoples and their descendants. We are gratefully to respectfully live and work as guests on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. This land acknowledgement is one small act in the ongoing process of working to be in good relationship with the land and the people of the land. Stephanie's going to start us off today with a brief introduction to the work that engendered this conversation today and the principles that guide this work.
As Jessica briefly mentioned, today's discussion is building off of research that our team conducted last spring. So we asked district leaders about how they were considering race and equity when they were making decisions about instruction during the pandemic. So from this data, we identified promising practices and we organized them around 3 key leadership principles, which you can see on the screen. So first, we found promise in practices that set up families as equal partners in learning. So that meant that families weren't just informed about decisions, they were really included from the beginning in the decision-making process. And in our interviews, leaders described how they reach families through cultural brokers. So that means people who can really bridge the divide between school and home around racial lines, cultural, linguistic, and power divides. An important shift was also for leaders to approach families as powerful teachers who bring rich assets into their children's education. Now, in partnering with families, leaders described tensions around, on the one hand, the desire for fast and efficient decision-making, and on the other hand, the desire for inclusive and democratic decision-making. Leaders also raised questions about how they might elevate the voices of the most marginalized families within these processes. Second, we observed leaders focusing on providing rich learning opportunities, even with the challenges of distance learning. So for example, we noted that leaders promoted flexible instruction that really fit families' needs and their capacity. And throughout all the uncertainty, leaders maintained their focus on critical thinking and conceptual understanding. Leaders were really challenged to work alongside teachers to build caring communities in online spaces, and also to fit the diverse home cultures and contexts that students were working within. The work was also complicated by the difficulty of finding meaningful ways to measure things like engagement and access, and it highlighted the need for collaboration with teachers' unions. And then finally, we identified leadership actions aimed at coordinated, coherent, and inclusive decision-making. So this leadership involved really centering core values rather than being distracted by all of the pressing technical details. So we saw that leaders built decision-making processes that engaged multiple stakeholders. So that included teachers, it included union representatives, families, classified staff, and students themselves. And leaders really ensured that the equity was preserved within these discussions and decision-making processes by making the processes formal and making sure that equity-driven tools were part of those processes. So in this work, leaders had to consider both the need to be flexible for local contexts that differed, but then also to maintain equity across schooling contexts. And similarly, leaders realized that the communities that they serve were connected. And so collaborating and connecting across districts was also important. So the link to the policy brief is here at the bottom of the slide. We can also bring that up at the end of the discussion, but today's panel leaders are going to talk about how these principles have been playing out in the ongoing work that they've continued to do.
Awesome, thank you. So this is the question that is driving us today. How are districts taking advantage of the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic to reimagine a coherent school system that values and nurtures Black, Indigenous, and people of color? For the most part, our local districts have been successful at the technical challenges created by the pandemic. Nearly all of our students have devices and are connected. They have access to food, and our teachers, students, and families are getting better and better at using technology in teaching and learning. Where we're going to dig in today is not technical. It's about how districts are rethinking the nature of learning. How are districts leaning into the opportunity of co-teaching with parents and families in ways that we've never done before? Rather than learning loss, how are districts developing policies and practices that value the learning that happens at home and amplify those? How are districts recognizing and reconciling that many of our students are thriving at home because they aren't facing systems of oppression each day in their school buildings? As districts begin bringing some students back into schools, how are they reimagining what teaching and learning looks like? This is challenging and ongoing work, and no one has arrived. And we don't want to return to a pre-COVID status quo. So where do district leaders see these opportunities and how do they leverage them? What's the work going forward? These kinds of questions will drive our panel and the following question and answer today. I also want to note the racial positionality of ourselves at UW and the panel today. We're mostly white folks serving students and communities of color. In this work of reimagining, we need to name racial dynamics as they play out in systemic inequalities in leadership. And at the same time, we face new opportunities to build solidarities across racial groups towards disrupting current racist systems and building new just ones. Next slide, please. So we are going to, this is just like some housekeeping about how to participate in the webinar. And to let you know what's coming. Each district is going to share their story for 10 minutes. And district folks, I'm going to count on you to keep your own time because I don't really know of a great way to let you know. And if you are significantly going over 10 minutes, then I'll just hop in and say, if you can wrap it up. At the end, we should have around 30 minutes for questions and answers. And please type your questions in the chat. That's how we'll figure out how to get the questions to the panelists. For the best view, turn off your video and click hide non-video participants. And then you'll be able to just see the participants that are talking at the moment, who will be the panelists. And we will have the slides and recording to be available afterwards. Just checking to make sure we are recording. We are. Okay, next slide, please. Here are our panel of leaders, and I'm just going to say their names and their districts, and then this is the order in which they'll present, and they'll introduce themselves with more elaboration. We have Dr. Rob Baumgartner from Edmonds, Dr. Tammy Campbell from Federal Way, Ellen Dorr from Renton, Suzanne Jurdy, Bernard Kuntz, and Jennifer Rennig from Highline, and Dr. Tracy Malloy from Northshore. So we will start with Rob, and I'm gonna hide my view and mute myself. Does everyone feel we're ready to move on? All right.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and thank you, everyone. As the slide said, I'm Rob Baumgartner. I'm with the Edmonds School District, and I'm the executive director of our student learning department. So that's our title for curriculum and instruction in the Edmonds School District, in case you were wondering. I'm really pleased to be here today to get to share some of the work that we're doing. And the big caveat I'll put on everything that I say is that, like I imagine other panelists, this really isn't me sharing what I think to be an exemplar. It really is what is a work in progress. And I'm glad that the focus is more away from the technical aspects of it, because we all have considerable stories to share about how we're communicating with families and how technology has changed the ways that we're engaging with folks. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, and I imagine many of the other panelists, is what we've actually learned about ourselves as a system in the midst of this crisis. And we keep joking among executive leadership here about, when we get that chance to have the postmortem on this whole thing, we've got some things to talk about. And one of those things that we have to talk about is really how in the midst of a crisis, we've learned really some really good metrics on our progress. And the one that emerged really early in the spring that was hugely disappointing, but also really shouldn't have been a surprise, was something that we had really said, we're doing good at this, was really engaging with our families and thinking about serving our families from a really an asset-based mindset. And as we jumped into COVID and we began, hearing more and more about how the COVID crisis was impacting those furthest away from educational justice, I was struck right away by how the language shifted in our district. And it was pretty clear that how we had said we were working really hard to not take a deficit mindset, and we'd probably been patting ourselves on the back a bit about our efforts to be more asset-minded. We weren't there. It was disappointing, and so we had to immediately name that. And a few things kind of happened that were kind of nice, really informal, but helpful. And both are associated with the UW, actually. Dr. Annie Shimaro put out an article early in the spring that was a summary of her book that was recently published, but really naming that school districts run the risk of exacerbating so many of the existing inequities when we don't acknowledge all the wonderful things that are happening at home, all the wonderful learning that is taking place. And there was a Facebook post by Dr. Anthony Craig who talked about his children, he's Indigenous, and his children, that the relief and the stress that he saw leaving their bodies as they got to spend more and more time together as a family. And so while we certainly know within our system that our kids that are furthest from educational justice are being impacted greatly, we had to keep reminding ourselves that good things are happening. And we saw evidence of that all the time. I have the great pleasure of having to actually be in the office most days, and I enjoy it. I hide in my office and shut the door, and I feel quite safe. But when I left the building most days in the spring and summer around 5 o'clock, there'd be a queue of parents that were there to get, a charger cable or a replacement Chromebook. And they were always our families that were non-English speaking and families of color. And what that said to me was that what we already know is that our families will go to whatever lengths they need to go to make sure that their kids have what they need to have for their education. And so it's been part of the ongoing work. And the unfortunate thing is, of course, it keeps rearing its ugly little head. And we have lots of opportunities regularly to remind our teachers, our leaders, and our broader community that, yes, this is very difficult for families, but there are still really good things happening. There are lots of benefits to our students having these extended periods at home where they are working closely with their families, where they're learning about their culture in deeper and more lasting ways, and all the while not discounting the importance of what we're doing, our core mission as educators. As we're turning the corner on the quarter, we're going to get quarter grades, and I have to admit, I applaud our colleagues in Bellevue that have decided not to post quarter grades, but we're going to have that, and that's going to be a significant data point. And we're really driven, despite what we know what it's going to tell us, to make sure that we're looking at those data in the most disaggregated ways and really drilling down and finding out what success is happening and not happening for our students in the system. But at the same time, making sure that we're messaging that that's not all, that there is so much more happening for many of our kids, and that the only learning that they're having isn't the learning that's just happening at school. And that's a hard message to sell at this stage. We're a quarter in. We have teachers that have been working incredibly hard to produce learning experiences that are meaningful. and they want those to remain front and center, and we completely understand. And so it's a real balancing act, but I think it captures the work that we're doing that is often in the background. It's the conversations that we have one-to-one or in small groups, and we're working on pushing that out in more of a public and sort of across the community way. So I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Tammy Campbell, who will pick it up.
Thank you, Rob. As you shared, a lot of some of what you said provoked and sound very akin to what we're experiencing in Federal Way. I want to start off by saying that I believe COVID blew the window dressing off of inequities. It revealed to us what many families already knew. And I will say that we will never go back to the school system we had prior to COVID. And the reason I think that we won't is that our parents are now home with their children, learning about them as learners. And they're going to be coming back with expectations that they probably didn't know to have prior to us transitioning to the work that we're doing right now. They will be much more technology savvy. Our scholars will be much more technology savvy. I think we're right now in the middle of this, so we can't really understand, but I suspect 2 or 3 years from now, there's going to be career shifts and career changes and plans made for scholars that they wouldn't have ever made had they not had this time. So there's some gifts in this for us. And I think one of them will be parents who are now understanding better how to educate and advocate for their children. I want to start with that. I want to briefly talk a little bit about Federal Way pre-COVID. I'm in my 6th year as superintendent. Federal Way has about 25,000 scholars. I use the word scholar on purpose because I believe this work of equity happens even in the words you choose. And we launched our strategic plan almost 6 years ago now. And the reason I bring that up, if you didn't know where you were going prior to COVID, there's nothing like a storm to really throw you off. And so districts who had a clear sense of their goals and their mission and what they were measuring success by, I think would fare better, because that then becomes your rudder to really point you in the right direction during a crisis like COVID. And we've been working on equity, racial equity, since late 2015, early 2016, doing work with every stakeholder group in our district, because that was something that we knew mattered. Our goals, big goals that we have, and as a result of that, we have seen over the last 5 years a steady increase of our grad rates. We are at 88% now. We're the most diverse district in the state, 5th most diverse district in the nation with 120 languages. So it's very important to have those clear goals. And when you think about Marzano's work about districts that actually show improvement, that's one of the indicators. I will also say that we have had in our district a real focus on rigor and making sure that no matter which school our scholars were in, we had what we would call a guaranteed curriculum experience. Because my belief is that the greatest friend of the achievement opportunity gap is variability, where we leave it up to the judgment and biases of individuals. And so how do you sort of pair those things together? We're also a district that has standards-based grading and reporting in place. So we have been focused on the grade, actually measuring what scholars know and are able to do so that they know what their next steps are. Again, that's going to come up again in COVID. And we had some real good movement in terms of getting parents involved in parent engagement. And we had started the work of a lot of having scholar engagement happening at the superintendent level, at the board level, all this pre-COVID. And I tell you those conditions because that then COVID happens. And what do? We say, let's continue to focus on our goals and let's let that theory of action drive the design of our remote model. We're in full remote right now. Federal Way, the city itself, has about 500 cases of COVID per 100,000. So we've been one of the highest rates of infection in terms of districts for a while now. So we are solidly in the remote model. Over the summer, what we did, we pulled together a group of about 100 folks, And we had a significant number of parents from all across our district because we knew what we did in March needed to be strengthened. And those parents told us some things. They wanted consistency in our LMS. They wanted consistency in how Canvas was set up. They wanted consistency in how we designed our lessons and those things. And we used that leverage and parent voice. And then we convened a group of scholars to tell us what they needed, because again, that's an important data point. And they told us again how we could get better. And then we designed our continuous learning plan for the fall. That then shaped our remote learning model. And we have seen some pretty positive feedback from our families. I asked every one of our principals to have 2 Zoom meetings per month with their parents to continue to get feedback on how it goes. And every principal meets with the scholar. And often we talk about what we're doing and how we're listening to families. I would stretch that. We should be talking to students, because there's a quote that I just firmly believe in: how long are we going to continue to build and rebuild systems without once consulting with the people it's intended to serve, our scholars? So principals meet once a month with a group of about 20 to 25 students to see how things are going. And the one requirement is that that group of students is reflective of the diversity of the school, reflective of the diversity of success. And they then drive and inform the continuous improvement efforts at the school level. I do the same as superintendent in that I meet with the scholar advisory panel across the district, and they've been telling us things about how it's going. This group met this summer though and framed up our continuous learning plan. We created a framework and a guidebook, an actual tool and resource for our families and for staff about some commitments we would make. And we did that in partnership with the union that really outlined what the day would look like. So it's consistent from school to school. What would it look like in terms of best practices? And so we are all reading a common text, the digital learning playbook, so that we can really get a clear sense of best practices there. We publish monthly 2 or 3 teacher best practice videos of teachers showing them using formative assessment and high levels of engagement using Padlet and other tools to engage our scholars. And between those scholar advisory groups at the school and the parent advisory group, that's how we're leaving out this racial equity conversation, because again, we're listening directly to scholars and families about how things are going. Now, here's the truth. No matter how good this remote learning is, it's never going to be as good as face-to-face. That's my fundamental belief. Because while I do believe that kids can be at home learning about their culture, what we also know for real, it's parents of color, families of color, parents of poverty who are working 2 or 3 jobs, who cannot be at home teaching in the way that our more affluent families can. That's what I mean when I say that COVID blew the lid off, because you can look at the national level where the wealthy are getting even more wealthy. And I suspect in school systems, the parents with means are getting their scholars farther ahead. That was why in one of our non-negotiables was that teachers had to videotape their lessons at the end of the day. So if a parent worked, they could see the video at least to know how to support their scholar. And so I would say that while this isn't ideal, we're making the best of it. And I believe our teachers are also going to be more equipped to have best practices in terms of using those digital tools to personalize the environment. We still have a lot of work to do. One of our pride points is that we're averaging about 95% attendance daily, but we're still noticing some differences for our scholars of color. We recently convened some of our principals as late as actually yesterday. And we had what we call our sort of a critical friends. Each of them took about 20 minutes to share best practices of what's happening in remote learning in their building. How are they leading as racial equity leaders? And what are those practices that, whether we were in a COVID pandemic or not, that they would continue to ensure that it was spread across their school. So we've learned a lot from that. And grading was one of the big issues that surfaced. I would say to you that we're going to be a stronger system as a result of this, but there will be loss in terms of what happens for our scholars. We know a lot of them are struggling socially, emotionally. We know that some of our scholars are having some serious mental health challenges as a result of that. And so we're already starting to think about when we're in hybrid and when we begin to be in face-to-face, what type of supports we will be providing for our scholars in that situation. So that's sort of an overview of where we are. We're learning. The good thing is we had clear goals, clear vision, clear metrics ahead of time. And what that allowed us to do was to be coherent and decisive and designing what our remote model was going to do. Because no matter the modality, the goals and the outcomes we have for our scholars, even the tagline that you see above my head, those things still remain true. And that helped us to feel like we were anchored as we made those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Oh, Ellen, you already knew.
I was on the ready.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I've been taking so many notes from people. This is wonderful to hear what people are doing, and I think there are a lot of commonalities. So I'll frame sort of some learning for Renton, and as people named, when you are faced with something this large, you need to fall back on your core values and really think about those. And as a district, our core values are service, excellence, and equity. And so we have grounded our decision making in those core values. In our strategic framework, we really talk about family and community engagement, excellence in learning and teaching, and removing barriers and supporting students. So we have been continuing to think about those things through this pandemic. And also, in some ways, even though we are dealing with all of the immediacy, trying to think about how we can leverage this as a catalyst to move our school systems to be more humanizing and more equitable, which is what we ideally are creating for students. I want to share a couple of pragmatic pieces that I believe are helping us move in that direction. One is around democratic decision making. So versus efficiency, we realize there are ways you can make decisions that could be faster for people. However, as people have named, it's really important to have stakeholder engagement, really listening to students and families. As Dr. Campbell shared, we had a planning team in the summer, June, of over 120 teachers who helped us think through what does schooling need to look like in the fall, whether we are in full remote or partially hybrid. And we did not talk about learning loss. We know learning is happening all the time. It was schooling that was different, right? So we were really trying to center learning and thinking about what is worthy of students' time, what is worthy of families investing time and energy into that learning. We were not asking families to recreate school at home. But we really focused on those learning tasks. And the work that was done by teachers was also informed by what we were hearing from students and families. We had a great community partner who had done a full report leveraging relationships that existed within the community to highlight for us what families who are most marginalized were saying, and echoed some of the same requests as Dr. Campbell named in terms of consistency, clear communication, also thinking about students' social emotional learning needs. And so we built that into our planning in terms of SEL being a foundational piece of everything that was happening. So in every sort of content area, we wanted the planning teachers to be thinking about how are you building connection in this digital world? And then how is it embedded within each learning task? So it's relevant for students. Students feel connected. We know learning is relational. So that takes us to my next idea is around, we really focused on prioritizing relationships, including in operations. So one efficient way to distribute technology is to say, everybody come to central office and get it. That might have been a great way for us to distribute Chromebooks. Instead, we made events at every single school so that families could see who the adults that would be engaging with their students were. So it's much harder on the back end for the operations team or for my team, but so much more powerful for students and families to say, this is your first grade teacher. She gets to wave through the window, and a student picks up the technology they need and the resources they need. Our schools have continued to do distribution days like that, and it's really become a community event. So rather than focusing on efficiency, it's really about centering relationships. Additionally, we've done that with some technology guidance. We've had some requests where people say, can you ensure that students always have to turn their camera on because then we know they're engaged? For a number of equity reasons, we don't think that's the right call. And so we don't require that. We talk about what are the ways in which you can ensure students are engaged, that you're checking for assessment or for understanding, that you're ensuring that they feel comfortable and safe to participate in a variety of ways, rather than just making that rule. The last one I'll mention is really around stakeholder engagement. So as I said before, we've really relied on our CBOs. That's been a huge partnership in terms of how do we support families in navigating resources, and what other needs do they have? We've also done empathy interviews. So we've reached out to students directly to ask, how is this going? What is working for you? What do you think needs to be different? They've also explained to us very clearly, very articulately, here's why I turn my video on in this class, and here's why I don't in this class. And so that information is super important for us. And then we've done a lot of home visits. Our schools are doing many home visits to connect with our families and support them. We're also really trying to prioritize authentic partnerships and not partner with families in an extractive manner. So we met with Dr. Ishimuro in the spring also to think about how do we really hear from families without it being sort of like we're just taking things from them. This needs to be about partnership. And so that's another place that we're really focusing. And then I will hand it over to Highline.
Great. Thank you, Ellen, and good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Drudy. I'm the Chief Academic Officer in Highline Public Schools, here with a couple of my colleagues, Jennifer Reinig and Bernard Kuntz. And just to begin with, Highline is neighbors to Renton and our friends in Federal Way, and so many similarities that we're all experiencing. We're about 18,000 students, so a little bit smaller, but beautifully diverse families and students that we have the privilege of working with. And, over the last 8.5 months through this pandemic, we have all been managing to what is very often rapidly and quickly changing scenarios and evolving situations. And sometimes I always refer to it as a bit of quicksand out there, right? So decisions are being made very quickly because things are changing. And there's 3 things that we have held true to in service of our strategic plan and our promise of knowing every student by name, strength, and need. And they include many of the things you've already heard, so I won't take long, but the multiple perspectives, as Dr. Campbell shared, as Ellen shared, talking to families, talking to students, talking to staff and principals is really has been the name of the game, and it's been ongoing. And it's exciting, but it's actually been critical. It's the only way we can make the decisions and do this in a way that's going to be successful for our students and our families and ourselves. The second is really, there has been such a need for clear, decisive communication. Never before have I been asked for clarity and decisions in the way that we have been asked in the last few months. And I think as we look at our community, as we look at our state, our country, and the world, that uncertainty and that moving landscape, we all feel it. So having clarity and decisions has just been a must for many of our staff, but our students and our families as well. And our third one is really that continued commitment to our equity policy. I love what Dr. Campbell said, and I wrote it down, that that the pandemic has blown the window dressing off the inequities, and that is so true. They've always been there, but now you can't dispute them. And so we have really tried to keep that front and center. A couple of years ago, our district adopted or revised our equity policy, and we built or developed an equity lens. And I just pasted the questions in the chat for you. But these questions have been driving our decisions, our actions, and our practices, not as much as they need to, and we have more work to do, but they've certainly driven our work and our practices and decisions more in the last 8.5 months than at any time in the past. But really asking questions about who is affected and what is that impact, Have we intentionally involved our stakeholders, as many of my colleagues have talked about already? And would those stakeholders agree with what we think is the impact? What are the barriers and how are we mitigating for the barriers? So these questions have really been important. And so what we're going to do is go actually deeper in one area that Rob actually brought up earlier, and that's grading. We really believe our grading policy is an example of needing multiple perspectives, and the equity policy, and really being clear and decisive with decisions. And we know that our community, our board, our principals, our staff, our students, our families, they all have very strong opinions and positions around grading. We also know that grading has shifted. Our guidance from the state shifted. We got some late guidance. It's been evolving both at the district level and at the state level. And we know that grading really brings with it some complex questions about implications. What do grades mean? What are the impact of grades? Who's impacted by those grades? So it really is an equity question as well. So in a moment, Jennifer's going to kind of share a brief description of our approach with elementary. And how we have attended to that in a way that we're trying to really do the best work we can in support of our students and our students owning their learning. And then also really getting into secondary with high school. Bernard's going to go deep into the high school grading and really how we've really tried to address a principle 3, going back to that research brief about coordinated, coherent, and inclusive decision making. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer.
All right, thanks, Suzanne. So hello, everybody. As Suzanne said, I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the shifts that we made last spring and continuing into this fall at the elementary level as it relates to our existing or previous practices around grading and report cards in particular. And this is not unique to Highline. As named in the policy brief, there are similar examples in districts around us. But we recognized really early on in the spring that there were opportunities to change status quo and to look at our practices in different lights. And we realized that in that situation in the spring, there were many barriers in place for so many, for our students, for our families, for our staff. And we, as we were making sense of our new context, really recognized that we did not want to perpetuate a system where we were providing a grade that might more reflect the barriers than the strengths and the assets and the learning that students were engaging in. So we shifted our focus to one of communication of the content that we are working to engage students around, and really using a strength-based approach, noting how students were able to engage. So we tried to offer, as many of our colleagues around the region did, multiple opportunities for engagement, whether that was online or paper packets, and trying to be as creative as possible for ways for students to engage in their learning. And teachers were encouraged to, via comments on a report card, to reflect that. What were students able to do despite the challenges of that time? So we eliminated the use of grades in any way at elementary and really focused on feedback. An important component of this, recognizing the value and the importance and the opportunity of learning that was family-based and happening in the home last spring, is that we encourage teachers to note that learning in those comments on individual students' report cards. So we saw things around learning opportunities at home if students were taking up a new hobby or learning more about their culture, or engaging in a new learning around gardening, cooking, whatever it might be. Those types of things were valued and those types of things were noted on their report card. And again, that was an opportunity to highlight the variety of learning and engagement that students were doing, both with teachers, but importantly with their families. So this fall, we're continuing the comments only approach based on input from our community, and really focusing on creating opportunities to provide more meaningful information to families than simply a number on a scale might have provided. We have provided teachers with example comments that are more connected to learning standards for this fall, but still providing guidance around valuing and supporting the learning that's happening at home as well. The intention there is that teachers would customize and personalize those comments based on the unique strengths and needs of each individual learner, that's informed by their weekly communication with that student and their families. So with that, I'll turn it to Bernard to say more about the secondary model.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So at the secondary level, we knew that we had to attend to grading in the springtime. And of course, in the early days and the first weeks, there was a lot of conversation about what's going to happen and how do we think about this and what's going to happen when and who and where. And there was a big need to gather a lot of information. And for us, I think some clarity came really in talking with other school districts and understanding the directions they were going, as well as some shifts that were happening at the university level, as we had some major university systems come out and talk about how they were going to approach looking at grades for this particular semester and point in time. So we felt like we were kind of late in making a decision and providing guidance to our teachers on what to do about grades. And so on April 16th, I worked a lot with our communications team and Suzanne, and we worked on this big memo that went and made this big announcement that said, okay, here's the plan. We're doing pass or no credit. You have to pass the class or you get no credit. And that was going to be the plan. And that was based on using a lot of those equity tools, a lot of consultation with a lot of people. And then a few days later, on April 22nd, we got a memo from our friend Chris down in Olympia that said, no, we gotta rethink that. We're doing that different across the whole state. So quickly, what we did is we listened to that, and then we saw why that made sense. And it was an example for me of how to be nimble and how to think that, there's a way to think outside of, you can do a lot of work and gather a lot of information, and yet there is sometimes a larger wisdom that you need to follow and a direction you need to follow and make the most of it. And so there were some really good things came out of that particular decision, including shifting to the incomplete grade concept and thinking through how we can provide that in the most equitable way as possible. So in many ways, I look back at that decision and I'm really glad that we got the guidance from OSPI that we did. And we were able to shift what we were doing to make that all a lot better. But there was a lot of coordination that had to happen very quickly in communication. I think we've never sent out so many direct emails to principals and staff as we have in the last 9 months. So then moving forward, we had to think through what this coming year or what this current school year was going to look like. And moving forward, what we decided to drop the D and the F from our grading scale permanently, that we were no longer going to have those as part of our grade scale. And this was part of a larger shift to work with standards-based grading and aligned with how we wanted to think about grading at the secondary level when we're in the distance format. So we went out and we provided some guidance to teachers. At the same time, we were providing guidance on how we're going to recoup those incomplete grades and make good on those incomplete grades to try to mitigate learning loss that had happened. And we came up with a plan where students would get an A, a B, a C, or an incomplete, an in progress grade, which kind of holds their grade until they're able to demonstrate their learning, or they would get a no credit. And that was our plan moving forward. But because of the importance of continuing to listen to stakeholders and to listen to feedback, we actually ended up changing our plan in late October. And a group of our principals who, of course, are working very closely with families and kids and understanding the situation very close to the ground, came up with a slightly different plan. And instead of giving students an in-progress grade, we shifted our plan to instead include an A, a B, or a C. Or if a student who is trying to access and is not able to access, to fully access, they're assigned a P grade, which then we're committed to working with that student to be able to help them convert that P grade to an A, B, or C grade after that happens. So in that conversation, there was a lot of back and forth in trying to listen and understand those equity those equity lens questions that Suzanne shared were very much part of the conversation that we had with our colleagues at Cabinet as well. So we were able to get out our first batch of quarter grades. We're actually in the process of doing that right now. Our first quarter ended. We're doing a three period program this year, and so we had that first batch of grades out. And part of our ongoing commitment to that is looking at any disproportionality that appears in those, and then addressing that as we move forward.
Thanks, Highline. Tracy.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm Tracy Malloy. I'm the Chief Leadership and Strategy Officer in the Northshore School District. And I am going to just reiterate a few of the themes that I've already heard my colleagues share today. First being that the inequities in our school system have always existed, right? But the pandemic has just magnified them. They've brought them to light, and they've made them something that we absolutely cannot ignore. And so I want to start with that. I also would like to recognize the theme that I've heard, that school leaders are making critical decisions and being asked to communicate about these decisions clearly and frequently, and perhaps more so than we've ever been communicating about what's happening in schools and why we're making certain decisions. And then finally, the theme that I've heard is that the pandemic has provided schools with the opportunity to really reflect and to consider how to improve what we're doing in the service of our students. So I just want to recognize that those are things that Northshore is doing, and that all other school districts are also doing as well. In the Northshore School District, we're committed to creating a safe and caring, mutually respectful environment. We believe that we need to make sure that all of our students and our families feel welcomed and supported and valued. And so as we faced the reality of closing schools last winter and through the spring, and then began to plan for the 2021 school year, we realized that the commitment that we have to our families and to their children had to actually come alive. It needed to become visible. And to that end, we employed a variety of different strategies that attended to the priorities that are outlined in the policy brief. So I am first going to speak to the ways that our school system has intentionally included families as equal partners. We have always believed that it is important to listen to the voices of the children and to their parents. And when we closed our schools, there was a need to make sure that we remained connected and remained able to hear from our community about their needs and what they wanted in terms of the education for their kids. Northshore Superintendent, Dr. Michelle Reed, and our Chief Communications and Experience Officer, Lisa Youngblood Hall, developed a communication strategy that served the dual purpose of sharing information as well as soliciting input from the community. There was an original Northshore Learns broadcast that evolved from a daily look inside the leadership cabinet COVID response to a weekly update that's now provided by Dr. Reed. And the weekly updates now often include invited guests, such as students, educators, parents, guardians. They share their experiences. They talk about what's being done in terms of the innovation and best practices that they see and experience in the education system. And we also have other methods of continuing to communicate with our community, which include regular meetings, they're virtual, with parent and guardian groups. We have multiple opportunities for the community to submit questions and ideas that can help us improve the way we serve students. We've made some very big edits to our website as a result of the need to be clear and concise about how we're communicating regarding the efforts to educate children in the middle of a pandemic. We make regular COVID-19 updates available, and Dr. Reed sends messages about those updates regarding the data that's in the community and how we are making decisions about when to phase students back into school buildings. And we provide regular opportunities for parents and guardians to connect on the learning management platform. We've got parent groups now that are meeting and collaborating with one another. Additionally, we felt that it was going to be very important to start the year building relationships in ways that perhaps we've never needed to do when we're in person. And that's not to say that relationships don't get built, but when we looked at the spring and how people felt disconnected from one another, because it is hard to engage across the screen, we realized that beginning the school year with a clear focus on building relationships was essential. So we did so during the first 3 weeks of the year. We invited families at the elementary level to participate in individual family meetings, similar to when they engage in conferences. We encouraged all teachers to ask the adults in our students' lives to share information that was relevant to how students have been coping with the pandemic, how they learn best, and the supports that they needed, but maybe didn't have in place. And that's because when we listen to our families, when we listen to our students, we learn information from them that helps us really make sure we're meeting their needs. We've continued the efforts to build relationships and involve families as equal partners. For example, found out that there were certain families who hadn't connected to technology. And so we did offer an event both in school locations as well as at our central office to those individuals who still needed help connecting to the learning management system, to even creating an email address that would help them connect to the learning management system, to knowing how to log in on their district provided device. We did that just recently and have made sure that absolutely everybody is now able to be remote. And we feel that open communication between all of our school district members, especially between the superintendent and the members of the cabinet and the members of our racial and educational justice team, has really helped every student and their parent or guardian feel that their voices are heard and that their voices matter. When it comes to the principle around rich learning opportunities, something that is a result of how we've needed to support learning online is that there's a centralized group known as the Northshore Learns team that meets regularly. And the team is comprised of members of our communications, curriculum and instruction, instructional technology, racial and educational justice department, special education, student services. Together, this group of educators is working to support the day-to-day learning of students through the ways in which these individuals are providing professional learning tools and resources for our teachers. The Northshore Learns team is regularly communicating with instructional staff through district newsletters. We encourage teacher collaboration through groups formed on our learning management system. This group is also planning and implementing weekly professional development and also developing what we're calling bite-sized professional development, which are videos that we send to everyone on a weekly basis. And we also provide school-based support to individuals as needed. And then lastly, I'd like to address how we feel that the principle of coordinated, cohesive, and inclusive decision-making continues to stay alive in Northshore. We, in the summer, much like every other school district represented here, participated in a lengthy conversation with various representatives about our continuous learning model for this year. When we met with our families, we heard their needs. When our superintendent met with students and heard about their needs, that information helped to inform the conversation that then happened with our stakeholder group that developed our memorandum of understanding. And from that work, we have instituted twice weekly meetings with a group called the Steering Committee. And this group includes representatives from the superintendent's cabinet, association leaders, teachers, paraeducators, and other representatives. And these committee members come together with the purpose of monitoring the agreements that we made and the commitments that we made as part of our negotiated agreement. And we believe that it's that shared responsibility for decision making that has helped us to continue to stay resolute to the belief that in our house, every person matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Similar to some other folks where I've just been furiously taking notes there, and I imagine that that lots of folks have been across all the speakers. So we have some time for question and answer. Maybe if all the panelists could bring their videos back, that would be great. And I'm gonna start us off with a question while folks start asking their questions in the chat. And I'll put my question in the chat. I've already sent it to the panelists, but I'd like you to describe a leadership move and something that you did individually. So we talk about in L4L having like a video camera, right? And so like video cameras on you, and what's the leadership move that you made to keep racial equity centered in teaching and learning, and over however many months of this of the pandemic.
I'll start, Jessica.
Great.
Is that okay? So sometime in May, I had a group of scholars from a group we call SOAR, Students Organized Against Racism. They reached out to me specifically from TJ, and they wanted to talk to me about their vision for how Federal Way could be more of an anti-racist organization. And they listed 4 things, and one of the top ones was representation in curriculum. After meeting with that group, I then said, okay, this is TJ. I want to meet with the entire district. 2 or 3 weeks later, I had a scholar Zoom with the entire district from all of our secondary schools telling us what we could do. And then they created sort of a PowerPoint presentation that we shared at the school board meeting. And I did that on purpose. I did it because I knew Teaching for Learning would take those to-dos right from Scholar Voice, but I also wanted our community to hear it. And it was powerful to hear them talking about hiring more people. Suzanne, you'd be proud to know they referenced Highline's hiring of new teachers. They'd done research, and they talked about how you had hired more teachers of color. They talked about representation. They talked about curriculum. So now our curriculum folks are meeting with that group of scholars to get a sense of what that looks like. The big thing, though, is the ubiquitous nature of a question that I ask everyone to ask, and it's, what does race have to do with this? And no matter the meeting, no matter what, at our cabinet level, we write that question, and that's a question that we always insert in protocols. And we have been doing readings on racial equity since 2016. And this year, our reading is Caste and How to Be Anti-Racist, Kendi's text, and my board and I are reading it as well. And the board reading happens at a board meeting where we process, again, symbolic frame, thinking about Bowman and Dill's dimensions of leadership, and really letting our community know the board is grappling with this work and we're calling it out. So, and then as a result of that, our principals have what I call some runway room to tell their community and their teachers and their staff, this is work that everybody's doing. So a mixture of adaptive and technical approaches to this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Does someone else want to jump in?
Sure, I can jump in. As the leader of our curriculum and instruction function here in Edmonds, I've pleasure of working with a great team of leaders. And one of the things that we've been really pushing and I've been promoting is it's captured in the brief, which is, we get a lot of feedback. We hear from a lot of our constituents, but really asking the question, who are we not hearing from? And trying to center that in and really drill down to whose voices are not at the table. And much like the panelists, our leadership team looks a lot like me. And I think an additional challenge there is that so often in a curriculum and instruction function in a district, the people you support directly are the adults. And so much of the feedback that you get is filtered by individuals in the system who have a ton of their own perspective and bias and those kinds of things. So we've really had to figure out ways to tap into that user experience of our students and their families. And we've really had to do that through partnership with our other groups, whether that's our communications team, whether that's our equity team, but also, you know, sort of piggybacking on the work that they're doing, but also being more active in getting out there and making sure that it's not that we're just joining a Zoom meeting to see how it's going in the classroom, but insisting that we get the opportunity to talk with our students, right? So it's really about that piece about how are we making sure that those voices that we don't get access to, or we know are often muted just by the nature of the way our systems are built, trying to bring those more actively into the fold.
Thank you.
So I'll offer that one of the things that I've done in my role as the Chief Leadership and Strategy Officer, and as that person, I am involved in the planning for our all administrative team meetings on a regular basis. I collaborate very closely with our racial and educational justice team to make sure that the thread of our racial and educational justice work is seen at our ATMs. And recently, we had an ATM that it was just last week, so it landed 2 days after the election. And we know in our community that we have people who represent the variety of political opinions that are in the nation. And we also have school leaders that must continue to support the education of students and make sure that all students feel safe and welcomed and respected for who they are as individuals. So one of the decisions that I worked with the racial and educational justice team to make was to ensure that the most recent administrative team meeting was one where we could process as a whole leadership group, all 120 people who hold positions as principals, assistant principals, directors, et cetera. We could process what it meant for us as leaders to have to lead through these challenging times. Because we can't lose sight of the conversation. And as difficult as those conversations may be, we have to face them head on. And we have to make sure that we're always considering what our responsibility is as leaders in a system and leaders in schools and departments and buildings when it comes to calling out race as a barrier for the ways in which children have access to the programs that they need, and how we can dismantle the systems that are in place that need to be removed in order to ensure that we're not perpetuating the inequities in the system.
Thanks.
I can share one of the things that certainly I didn't do independently, but our team in Highline really worked on in the spring. We were recognizing, has been shared here today, the amount of questions and the seeking of clarity and direction that we were getting from many, but especially our teachers in the classroom who are really on the front lines of trying to figure out how do we support all of our students. And while we spent a few days working hard to answer each and every one of those questions as they came up, we quickly realized that that was not sustainable, and nor was it creating capacity in our educators to be able to utilize our equity lens, as Suzanne put the questions in the chat earlier, to answer those questions for themselves. So we took some scenarios and of real questions that we were getting and crafted a tool that outlined those scenarios and possible responses or sample responses utilizing the questions in that equity lens. And again, the intention there was to not have teachers relying on someone who happens to report to central office every day as the keeper of the information or the only ones that can answer those, but really trying to capacitate staff across the system and utilizing that equity tool to make their own decisions in service of students.
I would add, I think as we've talked about, you know, COVID being a catalyst for change, I also think June, with just the size of the Black Lives Matter movement, that also has become a catalyst for people being like, oh, I guess we do have to talk about this. Lots of people were talking about it. Plenty of people were resisting talking about it. But one thing I did as a leader is talked with my tech department about what does it mean for us to be an anti-racist technology department. And we named the things that we are doing, which is you know, prioritizing where we do one-for-one first. We had started with our school that had the largest percentage of African-American students. We have kind of removed a signature policy to take that barrier away, ensuring that the students receive great technology, not purchasing classroom monitoring software. It's an extension of a form of policing, and so it's not something that we're investing in currently. We've also really distributed voice among our team. That's an anti-racist strategy, and our team is diverse, and then really prioritizing student voice and family input in our decision making. So when we were thinking about whether students would be keeping their Chromebooks at home over the summer, we interviewed students and families to ask them, do you want this? Would you need this? We had some schools say that we should ask teachers too, and the data does not align, but we went with what students and families said.
I would echo, because it's come up so many times, but you know, the shift from we're engaging stakeholders that used to mean we're talking with teachers and we're talking with principals, which is important, to we're really listening and partnering with our families and our students, has really probably been the biggest leadership shift in our system, but definitely for myself, that energy around really keeping that student. I mean, we say students at the center, but do we really mean it with our actions and the questions we ask? And so just really keeping that student at the center and really making sure that partnership with families is not the afterthought. And I think that's one, you know, the bright lining in the pandemic is that has been forced in a way that will only benefit our families and our school systems moving forward.
I want to just echo what Suzanne just said. I think that is probably one of the most powerful catalysts for transformation. And so I have really pressed our team and specifically our principals to see their scholar advisory group as a structure of school improvement strategy, not just COVID. This should last. And so we're building that mechanism in. And so as we are really launching our equity teams, then that scholar advisory team works in tandem with them. And so we have a group of what we call PD advisors, and principals are a part of that. And we ask them, what are the kinds of tasks that we could outline for the year that would always have folks looping back to principals, looping back to scholars to say we're working on, for example, this tool in online remote learning. How is that going? And using them as a continual data source, using them as thought partners. And I think really legitimizing student voice, not just at the ceremonial level or just in a pandemic, but recognizing for the first time that this is a key component of school improvement.
Bernardo, do you want to share? You don't have to also if you don't want to. Okay. So far we have just one question in the chat. I was imagining hundreds and needing to cull through. So participants who are here, please add your questions. This is an opportunity to ask a set of really skilled and smart and experienced leaders tough questions or easy questions, but you could also ask some tough questions. So the question, Ellen did attach a link, but I think it would be good to maybe answer the specific question, which is why what are some of the reasons students shared about why they turn the camera on in some classes but not in others? And are there trends in the district that the district might be able to respond to systematically, and how?
Yeah, what we heard from students is a lot of it was around relationships, not feeling valued, or maybe just kind of thinking like, I don't really need to in this space, so I'm good, but I do want to in this other space because my teacher models for me making mistakes, my teacher takes risks, I want to connect with my classmates. So there were reasons that like you can still build that feeling of culture even in a digital classroom. And so it's connected to that classroom culture piece, but that's what students were naming. I think also teachers modeling humility and, problem solving through things together to think about how do we do this best? Like today I'm not able to share my screen. Who can help me with that? Like that makes kids feel more comfortable. Students feel more comfortable in being able to do some of that. And I think the way to share it is to keep highlighting what teachers are doing well. So if when teachers are having success with that, sharing it with colleagues, sharing that as a strategy.
Stephanie, did you want to?
I would.
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Campbell.
I would just say that that's when I had my parent focus groups, specifically my parent advisory group. That's the biggest concern they have is that scholars aren't turning their cameras on at secondary level. At elementary, we're not seeing it. And they feel like this is signaling to their children that school isn't being taken seriously. So it was interesting. I had 40 parents and about 38 of them listed this as the only concern, the main concern that they have. And when talking to my scholar advisory group, I think part of it certainly has to do with some teacher practice. But I think for some of our scholars, for the first time, they have control and they have the ability to turn that camera on and off. And we just have to recognize that. And I think that there's an exercise of control. And I think the more that we have students involved and their voices heard, I think that's a part of getting them, sort of included. The other thing we heard is that there are some equity issues with backgrounds. We issued some cameras, some laptops that didn't allow them to actually have virtual backgrounds, and they didn't want their homes to show. That was a part of it. And I think the other component of it is control. And so we've got some scholars right now coming up with strategies. We're issuing some options now for our laptops that we dispersed. We dispersed almost 7,000 laptops across the district, but a lot of them didn't have the ability to do the virtual backgrounds like the one you see for me. And so we're doing that, and we're asking scholars, what does it take? And then there's another combination of teachers. Some teachers just haven't really elevated this as an important component of their instruction. I mean, that's just the truth. And I tell them, could you imagine if you were face to face and a scholar had their head down or was under the desk and you couldn't see them? I mean, this is critical. One of the parents who spoke most vividly about this is that her scholar wanted to turn the laptop on, the camera on, and didn't because of peer pressure not to. So imagine what that feels like to want to turn it on, but if no one is turning it on and you can't, then you're having to comply with that too. So this is one of the most recent challenges or opportunities to figure this out. But what I will tell you, we don't have it figured out, but what we know is the answer lies with our students, who will be able to help us to better understand it. And so I think when I'm listening to Renton's approach, that sounds like the kind of approach that we're taking as well.
So another question is, what is changing in the role of the teacher related to partnership with families and youth? And how will this be different compared to a year ago? I think anyone could take that up.
I think the role of the teacher is one that has always required partnership, right, with students and families. And at this point, that particular aspect of teaching is elevated. In order for teachers to best serve the students, it's incumbent upon them to talk to the kids, find out what they're thinking, right? To survey them on a regular basis and find out what's working for the students, what's not working for them, and to actively seek the input of the parents and guardians as well. Finding out what the needs are that aren't being met and inviting the families to share what needs to happen in order for those needs to get met. So when I think about the Danielson Group and the framework for remote teaching, one of the components that's embedded into that particular framework as part of the 8 components includes component 4C, which is engaging families and communities in school. And it's a precursor to making sure that you have responsive learning environments and being able to engage students. So the role of the teacher related to partnering with families and youth becomes even more important than it has been, and should continue to remain as important, right? Because as Tammy has pointed out, we can't go back to the way things were before. We have to make sure that the lessons that we've learned from the time we've spent recreating school and the educational process and everything that we've done has to be lessons that we carry forward.
I agree. You know, a teacher could do great instruction. Well, they could do instruction in a classroom with kids in the classroom, and they may not interact or connect with the kid during class, but they might in the hallway or on their way in and or out of the classroom. That is much more difficult with our current environment. So teachers really have to, it has to be an intentional, and it's a different way of thinking. One of the things we've implemented, and it's, you know, teachers have done it across this country forever, but, you know, is that weekly touch base with one student that or a teacher has a group of students that they're connected with, and they're really intentionally touching base with them every week. And we know that teachers should just do that, and teachers do that, but we had to make it much more intentional because of the loss of all of that other connections that we no longer have when we're in one space together with fully remote instruction. The other thing I would say is that, you know, remote instruction, we have to be standards focused. We have to focus on learning. This cannot be seat time. This cannot be activities. It really is forcing teachers to be intentional and really focused on the most important learning. We talk about essential standards, you know, the priority learning for kids, and it's got to be focused in a way it hasn't been before. So again, an opportunity for us to use that lever after COVID. The last thing I'm going to say is that it's really, you know, it's the two-way video is exactly that, two-way. We talk about kids not turning on their cameras, but our families are, for the first time, for most of them, being able to see instruction. And that is creating opportunity and connection that we have never had before. And it is very stressful for many teachers to know that their teaching is now public in a way it's never been public before. And I hope we never go back. I mean, I hope we can keep those doors open, we can keep instruction open, and we can really partner with our families that way.
I'm gonna move on to the very last question. And Mike, I hope that you got some answer about continuing to survey the students from the different responses there. So I'm going to ask you for an optimistic closure. If you could each give a short vision of where we have potential to head.
I'll start. I want to pick up on what Suzanne said, because that is really the big thing. Parents are now in the classroom at their homes, and they are getting institutional capital on what this is supposed to be, and they're probably watching in areas where it might not be. And I think we can build on that. We've always said we wanted more parent engagement. We have it. That's one thing. Parents are now, we have this tool called where we can check parents' ability to monitor their scholar progress through their online grading system. We used to have like 60%. All of our schools at about 98% right now, federal way. So they are dialed in. That level of connectivity, and now they're getting the information and knowledge, and our teachers. I'm watching them boldly experiment with all of these tools on how to personalize the learning environment. I suspect if we keep this momentum up, when we come back, we'll have much more personalized environment using digital tools. We'll be able to partner more closely with parents because they will know exactly what that's like. And I think we're going to have folks who, for the first time, appreciate what teachers are doing, because I think that's another gift of this. People don't realize how hard this is. And now they'll have an appreciation of that. And I think we're going to appreciate even more than we have those souls that are in the schools, because I'll tell you, I'm haunted every day that I don't get to see them in the flesh. And I think there will be an appreciation for that we haven't had. All the while, we're stressfully trying to figure out how to close these gaps that have been created while they've been in their home environments. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I can jump on that comment. I have twin 5-year-olds who just started kindergarten in the Seattle School District. And I was not home yesterday in the morning when they joined their class, but it was their first day without their teacher. It was the first day with the substitute. And I'll admit my partner's been a little rough on the classroom teacher and some of the choices he made, but seeing what she's able to do and what the teacher who doesn't have relationships and doesn't have quite the level of skill, I completely agree with Dr. Campbell. I think that our parents are definitely getting a new respect. But with that, it comes a responsibility, and it speaks to the place where I'm pretty hopeful. And one of the pieces in here that in the brief that resonated with me and is something we know, but I appreciate that it was elevated, is that importance of reciprocal communication. And in particular with our families for whom language access is a concern. We have a new superintendent, we have a new executive director, both are Spanish speaking, and we've just been able to do some things that are so exciting. Our first community forum that was all in Spanish, using technology, leveraging the technology to really create that access. And what it's done though is I think it's opened more channels for that reciprocal communication. It's not just us meeting our compliance piece about delivering information in families' home language. It's about opening those channels. So I'm really excited about what that means for us moving forward, and so much opportunity for us to learn as a system from more of our families and stakeholders.
I think this opportunity I think the circumstances that we find ourselves in have provided us with the opportunity to really rethink schools. And, in Northshore, we're staying in the light, we're looking toward the future, and we believe that it's bright. There are students that are thriving with the freedom that they have to explore their creativity, to explore their passions. There are students that are demonstrating talents that, due to the way in which we've had to retool how instruction is delivered and how time is spent, especially in asynchronous learning time, students have been able to explore their passions. I was privileged enough to have 2 students share a lesson that they've developed that we'll be sharing broadly in the school system soon about pronoun use, right? And these are high school students that are finding a voice and a way to contribute to the learning of others because they feel that they can. The way in which school will be when we return to school buildings, I would like to think that we will continue to build upon the strengths that we have learned that each one of our students possess, and keep the momentum in that regard going. Yes, there are gaps that we're going to have to continue to contend with. And yet there are so many lessons that we've learned that I believe can help us shape a very bright future.
I definitely agree with my colleagues. So much of what's been said is really, I mean, we have opportunity, and we say a lot, don't waste a good crisis. We have it, and it's an opportunity for the future to really make a change. And as Tammy said, that window dressing has been blown off the inequities, and I think the optimistic future is that there's no putting it back. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. People cannot defend some of the racist decisions and practices anymore. It is out there, and we must address it. I think the other thing I would say is that education for far too long has been a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think with some of the tools and approaches and practices we have been forced as an educational community to learn, we can now support that variability in our students. And as my good friend Jennifer Reinig, has helped teach me and all of my colleagues, that variability is not our deficit, it's our strength. And we have an opportunity to really meet the needs of kids wherever they are and take them to that future.
Ellen, do you want to close us?
Sure. I guess just really short, a quick way to say it is I think that this is an opportunity for us to actually get to being student-centered, not just in words, but in actuality, and then move towards student-designed as well.
Awesome. Well, if everyone wants to turn your video on, and you could also unmute yourself. Oh, I don't know if can we unmute folks, Kendra? Have them have the ability to unmute themselves so we can all say thank you. Kendra's gonna work on it.
You can do that now.
I can do
that. And everybody can do that now.
Okay, great. You can all unmute yourselves and say thank you. That was really inspirational, and it's so great to hear the wonderful things that are happening across our region.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.